September 2nd, 2003. Bellevue, Idaho. The morning air was biting, cold. Hidden inside an ordinary garbage can, crumpled beneath everyday household waste, lay a pink cotton bathrobe. It was heavy, completely saturated with fresh human blood. A single latex glove clung to the saturated fabric. Just yards away, a 16-year-old girl sprinted down the pavement. Her hysterical screams shattered the quiet dawn. She was fleeing a brutal massacre inside her own home. But the bloody robe in the trash, it told a different story. A story of cold, calculated execution. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Bellevue, Idaho, sits at an elevation of just over 5,000 feet. It is a compact community in Blaine County, a place defined by rigid routines, early commutes, and an established social hierarchy. In 2003, the population barely exceeded 2,000 residents. It was an environment where financial stability dictated a family's standing. Alan and Diane Johnson represented the absolute peak of that demographic. Alan, a 46-year-old co-owner of a landscaping firm, built his business through grueling physical labor. Diane, aged 52, managed complex financial transactions at a regional title company. Their combined income afforded them a sprawling, immaculately maintained residence on a quiet cul-de-sac. They were completely devoted to mapping out a successful future for their children. Colleagues frequently noted that Diane was a perfectionist who expected the exact same level of discipline from her family as she did from her employees. Neighbors often mentioned to investigators that Alan was the neighborhood anchor, the man who enforced a strict standard of property maintenance year-round. Their public image was completely impenetrable. They presented a unified front of middle-class success. Their 16-year-old daughter, Sarah Marie Johnson, was the primary beneficiary of this structured environment. She maintained a high-grade point average at Wood River High School, competed on the varsity volleyball team, and navigated the social dynamics of her peer group with calculated precision. Teachers reported that Sarah was highly engaged in classroom discussions and possessed a natural aptitude for leadership. Classmates described her as socially dominant and intensely focused on her public image. The Johnson household operated on a strict set of internal rules. Curfews were enforced without exception. Academic performance was heavily monitored. Diane expected daily reports on Sarah's extracurricular activities, while Alan demanded absolute honesty regarding her social circle. Relatives stated that the parents were not abusive, but rather highly protective. They simply wanted to ensure that their daughter's college prospects remained entirely unblemished. For the first 15 years of her life, Sarah operated seamlessly within these boundaries. She attended mandatory family dinners, participated in approved community events, and dated boys who met her parents' strict criteria for respectability. The friction within the home was limited to typical adolescent grievances, minor arguments about weekend schedules, and the occasional dispute over phone privileges. However, the psychological baseline of the Johnson residence was highly fragile. The parents' demand for perfection created a high-pressure environment where failure was not an option. Acquaintances later recalled that Sarah began showing subtle signs of exhaustion under her mother's micromanagement. She complained to friends that her life felt entirely scripted, that her parents viewed her more as an ongoing project than an independent individual. Despite these underlying tensions, the summer of 2003 began with standard predictability. Alan expanded his landscaping contracts, and Diane secured new accounts. Sarah attended volleyball practice and spent her weekends at the local cinema. There were no police visits to the property. The neighborhood watch had zero reason to monitor the Johnson residence. The foundation of their family dynamic remained intact, operating exactly as Alan and Diane had designed it, right up until the final weeks of August. The shift in Sarah's trajectory began in June 2003. She crossed paths with a 19-year-old named Bruno Dominguez. He was a laborer from Mexico, a demographic entirely outside of the Johnsons' meticulously curated social circle. The 3-year age gap might seem marginal in adulthood, but in the context of a 16-year-old high school student and an adult male, it crossed a strict legal boundary in the state of Idaho. Bruno resided several miles away in a different social stratum. He did not possess the academic pedigree or the financial background that Alan and Diane demanded of their daughter's acquaintances. Sarah's attachment to the older man escalated with alarming speed. She rapidly abandoned her established routines. Friends noted to investigators that her previous interests, varsity volleyball, college preparations, and school social events, were abruptly discarded. She became singularly focused on Bruno. Her psychological profile shifted from a compliant, high-achieving student to a deeply obsessed, radicalized teenager. She informed her peers that she intended to marry him, completely disregarding the logistical and legal impossibilities of that plan. To solidify this fantasy, she even utilized her own savings to purchase an engagement ring for herself, presenting it to her friends as a symbol of their imminent commitment. She began deceiving her parents to facilitate secret meetings, creating a secondary, hidden life. Alan and Diane eventually uncovered the deception. Alan meticulously reviewed the household telecommunication records and discovered hundreds of hours logged with a single unidentified number. This physical evidence forced a direct confrontation. The discovery of the relationship triggered a massive internal crisis within the Johnson residence. The parents were confronted with a situation they could not manage through their standard methods of discipline. They realized their underage daughter was intimately involved with an adult male, a fact that constituted statutory rape under state penal codes. Alan conducted his own background inquiries and confirmed the older boy's undocumented status. This added a severe layer of legal concern for the highly protective father. The parents immediately instituted strict punitive measures. Sarah's access to the family vehicles was entirely revoked. Her daily schedule was placed under total surveillance. Diane began physically checking the teenager's location after school, demanding verifiable proof of her whereabouts at all times. Instead of submitting to the discipline, Sarah actively rebelled. The home transformed into a hostile environment. Relatives reported that the arguments between Diane and Sarah became a daily occurrence. Diane attempted to reason with her daughter, systematically explaining the long-term consequences of a criminal relationship and the destruction of her college prospects. However, the teenager refused to process the information logically. Sarah viewed her parents not as protectors, but as the ultimate adversaries. She started expressing deep hostility toward them in private conversations with her peers. She told classmates that she hated her mother and father, a stark contrast to the perfect family image the Johnsons had projected for over a decade. She even discussed vague plans about fleeing the country to live in Mexico, completely detached from the financial realities of such an extreme move. The conflict reached its absolute breaking point in the final week of August 2003. Alan and Diane realized that simple grounding and vehicle restrictions were completely ineffective. Sarah was still finding ways to communicate with Bruno through third parties and borrowed cell phones. The parents decided to deploy their final, most severe countermeasure. They sat their daughter down and delivered a non-negotiable ultimatum. They stated clearly that if she made any further contact with the 19-year-old, they would immediately involve local law enforcement. They intended to file formal statutory rape charges against Bruno. Furthermore, they explicitly noted that such criminal charges would guarantee his immediate incarceration and subsequent deportation from the United States. This ultimatum was the exact pivot point of the case. For Alan and Diane, it was a desperate, protective maneuver designed to save their daughter's future. For Sarah, it was a declaration of war. The threat of police intervention meant the absolute end of her relationship. Her obsessed teenage mind processed this not as a wake-up call, but as a direct threat to her survival. The case timeline indicates that immediately following this ultimatum, Sarah crossed a psychological point of no return. She stopped arguing. She stopped pleading with her parents. Her sudden, eerie compliance falsely signaled to Alan and Diane that their harsh discipline had finally worked. In reality, the teenager had simply shifted her focus from open rebellion to calculated execution. If her parents were the sole obstacle to her relationship with Bruno, she reasoned that the obstacle had to be permanently removed. The meticulous planning for a double homicide began in absolute silence. September 2nd, 2003, 6 a.m. The interior of the Johnson residence was entirely silent. The property operated on a rigid schedule, dictated by Alan's landscaping business. He woke up early. He proceeded directly to the master bathroom to shower, leaving his wife Diane asleep in the primary bedroom. This routine was an established fact. It was predictable. It was a fatal vulnerability. In her own bedroom on the opposite side of the hallway, 16-year-old Sarah initiated a calculated sequence of actions. She had prepared for this exact window of time. She retrieved a heavy, full-length pink cotton bathrobe. It belonged to her mother. Sarah put it on, zipping it completely over her regular clothing. She then stretched a pair of latex gloves over her hands. The objective was purely functional, creating a physical barrier against forensic blowback. High-velocity blood spatter is an absolute certainty in close-range shootings. The fabric would absorb the microscopic mist of biological matter. The gloves would prevent gunshot residue from embedding into the pores of her skin. She armed herself with a legally registered high-caliber firearm stored within the residence. The magazine was fully loaded. A round was chambered. She moved down the carpeted hallway. There was no hesitation. There was no frantic pacing. The trajectory was a direct, straight line from her bedroom door to the master suite. She stood in the doorway. The target was stationary. The distance was less than 10 feet. Diane Johnson was asleep. The firearm was leveled directly at her head. A single trigger pull was executed. The acoustic trauma was deafening within the confined space of the suburban home, a sharp crack that violently disrupted the morning quiet. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The pink cotton robe performed its intended function, absorbing the fine spray of arterial blood that followed the bullet's trajectory. The noise instantly alerted Alan. The sound of running water in the bathroom stopped abruptly. The door opened. He stepped out, confronting the immediate, violent aftermath. He saw his wife in the bed. He saw his daughter in the doorway. He saw the weapon. There was zero time for negotiation or processing the reality of the situation. The firearm was rapidly repositioned. A second shot was fired. This round struck Alan directly in the chest. The hydrostatic shock of the impact caused him to collapse backward onto the bathroom floor. The physical reality of the trauma was absolute. Two individuals completely neutralized within a span of seconds. The execution phase was complete. The disposal phase began immediately. Sarah moved with mechanical, adrenaline-fueled efficiency. She retreated down the hallway and exited the residence through a side door. She walked rapidly to the exterior plastic trash receptacle situated near the edge of the property line. She stripped off the heavy, saturated bathrobe. She pulled the latex gloves from her hands. She deposited both items directly into the garbage can, forcibly shoving them down beneath layers of ordinary household waste. The smell of copper and burnt smokeless powder lingered heavily on the fabric. This disposal was hasty. It lacked the meticulous, cold calculation of the execution itself. It was a critical tactical error. 6:20 a.m., the psychological switch was flipped. The calculated executioner vanished entirely. The hysterical, traumatized teenager was activated for public display. Sarah sprinted away from the property. She ran down the center of the paved asphalt of the cul-de-sac. Her bare feet slapped loudly against the cold concrete. She bypassed the immediately adjacent houses, running several dozen yards before violently striking the front door of a specific neighbor's residence. The occupants were jolted awake by the frantic, continuous pounding on the wood. They opened the door to find the 16-year-old in a state of absolute panic. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving. She communicated through breathless, high-pitched sobs that someone was inside her house, that she had heard gunshots, that her parents had been attacked by intruders. The neighbors immediately pulled her inside the threshold, locking their own doors and engaging the deadbolts. They later described her demeanor to investigators as thoroughly convincing. She exhibited all the physiological markers of severe shock. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. Her pupils were dilated. Her breathing was dangerously erratic. A neighbor grabbed a landline phone and dialed 911. The county dispatcher logged the emergency call. The communication was chaotic and fragmented. The caller relayed the teenager's claims of a violent home invasion. The dispatch center instantly upgraded the call to a high-priority alert, broadcasting a Code 3 response to all available patrol units in Bellevue and the surrounding Blaine County jurisdictions. The response time was minimal. The compact infrastructure of the town meant that armed officers were only blocks away from the scene. 6:27 a.m. The first marked patrol units arrived at the Johnson residence. The officers approached the structure with extreme tactical caution. Service weapons were drawn and leveled. They anticipated an active, armed suspect remaining on the premises. The exterior perimeter was rapidly secured. Officers noted the immediate environmental data. There were no unfamiliar vehicles parked in the driveway. A quick visual sweep revealed no signs of forced entry on the exterior doors or the ground floor windows. The glass was intact. The door frames were uncompromised. 2 officers breached the front door, announcing their presence. The interior was dead quiet. The thermostat was set to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, keeping the air cool and preserving the distinct, acrid scent of discharged cordite. It hung heavily in the stagnant air of the main hallway. They proceeded methodically, utilizing standard room-clearing techniques. They sliced the pie at every corner, visually sweeping the living room, the formal dining area, and the kitchen. Everything was perfectly organized. The illusion of middle-class perfection remained entirely undisturbed in the front half of the house. Then, they moved down the corridor and reached the master bedroom. The contrast was severe. The visual and biological data was overwhelming. Alan Johnson was located on the floor near the bathroom threshold. Diane Johnson remained in the bed. The officers immediately checked the surrounding closets and under the bed for suspects. The room was clear. The volume of blood loss indicated that immediate medical intervention would be useless. Paramedics entered the scene minutes later, escorted by armed police. Despite the obvious visual evidence, emergency medical technicians are required to follow strict diagnostic protocols. They attached electrocardiogram leads to both victims. The monitors displayed flatlines. Lividity had not yet set in, confirming the timeline of the attack. Both Alan and Diane Johnson were officially pronounced dead at the scene by the lead paramedic. The status of the property instantly shifted from a suburban home to a double homicide major crime scene. Yellow barricade tape was deployed across the manicured front lawn, establishing a hard perimeter. Detectives and crime scene investigators were pulled from their morning routines and dispatched to the location. The entire investigative apparatus was mobilized within an hour. Back at the neighbor's house, Sarah was isolated in a quiet guest room. A female patrol officer was assigned to sit with her, maintaining a constant visual. This is standard operating procedure for a surviving victim of a violent crime. The officer noted that her hysteria came in measured, predictable waves. She would cry violently, burying her face in her hands, then suddenly stop, staring blankly at the wall before starting again. The initial police theory aligned perfectly with her spoken narrative: a botched, high-stakes robbery, an unknown external threat. No one in the initial response chain suspected the weeping 16-year-old girl sitting wrapped in a blanket. The visual of the grieving, orphaned daughter was simply too powerful, but the physical evidence was already waiting in the plastic bin outside, exactly where she had discarded it. The clock on the homicide investigation had officially started ticking. The double homicide triggered an unprecedented tactical response from Blaine County authorities. Within hours, the narrative constructed by the surviving daughter dictated the entire direction of the initial manhunt. Investigators mobilized a massive dragnet across the region, operating strictly on the theory of a violent, targeted home invasion. The social echo within Bellevue was immediate and chaotic. A community that typically recorded 0 violent crimes per year was suddenly thrust into a state of severe paranoia. Residents locked their doors in broad daylight. Local hardware stores reported a complete depletion of deadbolts, window locks, and home security hardware by mid-afternoon. Parents pulled their children out of school, fearing an active shooter scenario. Rumors circulated rapidly among the neighborhood watch groups, suggesting that a coordinated gang or international cartel hit squad was actively operating within the city limits. This mass hysteria was heavily fueled by the brutal efficiency of the crime. 2 adults had been executed in their primary bedroom, yet the rest of the 3,000-square-foot house remained completely undisturbed. The local police department's switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from citizens reporting suspicious vehicles and unknown individuals. The illusion of absolute suburban safety evaporated in a single morning. Detectives concentrated their primary efforts on locating the 19-year-old laborer. He was the most obvious external variable in the victims' meticulously structured lives. Law enforcement understood that Alan and Diane had recently threatened him with statutory rape charges and immediate deportation. This provided a textbook, high-stakes motive for a preemptive strike. The working theory suggested that the older boyfriend had orchestrated the assassination to permanently silence the parents and facilitate an escape with the 16-year-old. Interagency task forces coordinated with federal immigration authorities, setting up checkpoints along major outbound highways and state routes leading out of Idaho. Tactical units in heavy body armor raided his known residences and the apartments of his associates. The entire investigative apparatus of the county was aimed directly at this single individual. However, this massive deployment of resources rapidly turned into a frustrating, absolute dead end. When officers finally apprehended the young man late that afternoon, his alibi was impenetrable. Multiple co-workers confirmed his continuous presence at a distant construction site during the exact window of the murders. Furthermore, he exhibited genuine, unfiltered shock during his interrogation. He possessed 0 knowledge of the house's internal layout and lacked any access to the specific caliber of weapon used in the attack. The primary suspect was officially cleared, leaving the investigative team completely stalled and staring at a blank board. With the external threat neutralized, the investigation experienced its critical midpoint pivot. The focus inevitably shifted back to the crime scene itself. Detectives were forced to completely discard the home invasion theory and analyze the rigid, unyielding forensic facts. The initial premise established by the fleeing teenager was fundamentally flawed. Crime scene technicians noted the complete absence of forced entry. The heavy wooden exterior doors were uncompromised. The ground floor windows were secured from the inside, and the digital alarm system had not been triggered by an external breach. More critically, the behavioral evidence did not align with a robbery. Thousands of dollars in consumer electronics, premium jewelry, and physical cash remained in plain sight on the kitchen counters and living room tables. An intruder motivated by financial gain does not bypass high-value portable items merely to execute 2 sleeping adults. The trajectory of the projectiles provided another glaring, undeniable inconsistency. The primary target was clearly the mother, shot point blank while asleep. The father was a secondary casualty, engaged only when he interrupted the sequence. This indicated a highly personal, deeply harbored motive, directed specifically at the matriarch of the family. The violence was not random, it was personal. The definitive fracture in the established narrative occurred just outside the residence. While the interior forensic team mapped the high-velocity blood spatter patterns across the bedroom walls, the exterior perimeter unit began a systematic grid-by-grid sweep of the property line. An officer inspecting the heavy plastic waste receptacles on the edge of the asphalt driveway noted a strange anomaly. Buried deep beneath a layer of fresh coffee grounds and discarded household waste was a heavy mass of fabric. It was a pink cotton bathrobe. The garment was completely saturated with arterial blood, matching the biological material currently pooling in the master bedroom. A single latex glove was adhered to the wet fabric, while a matching second glove was located deeper in the bin. This discovery completely shattered the illusion of a random attack. An external professional hitman does not take the time to locate a resident's bathrobe, put it on to prevent forensic blowback, and then meticulously hide it in the victim's own garbage can before fleeing the area. An outside attacker would bring their own protective gear and dispose of it miles away from the hot zone. The killer was not a phantom cartel member. The killer had unrestricted access to the house, intimate knowledge of the victim's sleeping routines, and a direct line to the murder weapon. The investigative lens slowly turned away from the streets of Bellevue and focused directly on the weeping 16-year-old girl sitting in the neighbor's living room. The suspect pool, which had briefly expanded to include international syndicates and a 19-year-old laborer, suddenly collapsed down to a single 16-year-old individual. Detectives formally transitioned their focus from the exterior perimeter directly into the structured environment of the local police interrogation room. The space was completely sterile, devoid of any comforting elements, and illuminated by harsh overhead fluorescent panels designed to induce psychological fatigue. The teenager was seated across from seasoned investigators. The initial tactical approach was entirely non-confrontational, specifically designed to let the suspect establish a baseline narrative. During the preliminary questioning, the teenager maintained the facade of a traumatized survivor. She informed the detectives that she had been deeply asleep in her bedroom, located directly across the hall from the master suite. She stated that a sudden, loud noise woke her up, prompting her to immediately flee the residence in absolute terror. However, as the interrogation progressed and investigators began applying subtle pressure regarding the exact timeline of the morning, her narrative began to fracture. She altered her account entirely. She later told the officers that she actually walked out of her bedroom, peered down the darkened hallway, and saw an unknown intruder standing near her parents' door before she ran away. When pressed on the critical acoustic details, specifically the fact that multiple neighbors reported hearing two distinct shots separated by a brief pause, her story shifted a third time. She claimed she fled the house before the second shot was fired, then contradicted herself minutes later by stating she ran out immediately after the final discharge. The detectives noted a complete absence of genuine emotional distress during these critical inconsistencies. She did not ask about the condition of her parents. She did not inquire if the supposed intruders had been apprehended or identified. Her primary concern, communicated through defensive posturing and evasive responses, was establishing her own distance from the master bedroom. Law enforcement utilizes a specific psychological metric when evaluating surviving family members in a homicide. Innocent survivors obsess over the perpetrators. Guilty survivors obsess over their own alibis. A physical examination of the teenager conducted later that afternoon provided another glaring inconsistency. A medical technician documented a distinct, dark, linear contusion on her left shoulder. When asked to explain the injury, she told the authorities that she had tripped and fallen into a heavy wooden coffee table while visiting a friend the previous weekend. The forensic pathologist evaluating the photographs completely dismissed this explanation. The dimensions and the specific localized tissue trauma of the bruise perfectly mirrored the violent, rearward, mechanical recoil of a high-power weapon being fired against a human collarbone. While the interrogation stalled in a loop of shifting indirect speech, the forensic division achieved a massive breakthrough. The physical evidence recovered from the exterior waste receptacle was transported to the state crime laboratory. The central piece of evidence was the heavy pink cotton bathrobe. Forensic analysts deployed microscopic evaluation techniques to map the biological material. The distribution of the fluid was not a random smear or a transfer stain from a brief touch. It was high-velocity impact spatter, a distinct mist-like pattern created only when a projectile strikes a human target at close range. The fabric had absorbed the arterial spray, confirming the garment was worn by the shooter during the exact millisecond of the execution. The secondary items recovered from the trash bin proved even more devastating to the teenager's fabricated timeline. Analysts processed a discolored latex glove and a single left-hand leather winter glove, both found rolled tightly inside the saturated bathrobe. The latex glove matched a specific brand stocked in a first aid kit located inside the family's garage. More importantly, it yielded microscopic epithelial cells from the interior lining. DNA extraction protocols were initiated using advanced polymerase chain reaction technology. The genetic profile generated from the sweat and skin cells was a direct, irrefutable match to the 16-year-old daughter. The origin of the leather glove further cemented her direct involvement. Investigators recognized the item as part of a set normally stored in the mother's sport utility vehicle. The matching right-hand leather glove was discovered hours later, hidden underneath a pile of ordinary clothing directly inside the teenager's own bedroom. The exterior of the latex glove, along with the recovered left-hand leather glove, was then subjected to chemical swabbing. Both items tested positive for heavy concentrations of barium, antimony, and lead, the undeniable chemical signature of a discharged firearm. The investigation then turned to the ballistics. Crime scene technicians analyzing the trajectory of the blood spatter determined the shooter stood firmly on the east side of the bedroom, firing at a precise downward angle. They had already determined the fatal rounds were fired from a .264 caliber high-power rifle. The projectile velocity exceeded 3,000 feet per second, causing catastrophic structural damage to the victims. Detectives needed to locate the origin of this specific, highly destructive weapon. The search grid was expanded to include a small guest house situated on the family's property. The structure was currently rented to an associate who was verified to be out of town for the long weekend. Inside the tenant's unlocked closet, investigators located the murder weapon. The final piece of the logistical puzzle was secured when detectives executed a secondary search warrant on the teenager's bedroom. Resting in plain sight on a small bedside table was a brass key. The key perfectly fit the deadbolt of the guest house. The physical chain of custody was now complete and entirely unbroken. The teenager possessed direct access to the high-power rifle, knew the tenant was absent, and utilized the weapon to execute the double homicide before returning it to the structure. The psychological profile of the crime revealed a level of cold, mechanical calculation that disturbed even the most veteran homicide detectives. The suspect did not act in a sudden fit of adolescent rage. The sequence of events required deliberate, multi-step preparation. She retrieved the guest house key. She acquired the high-power rifle. She returned to the main residence and deliberately layered protective clothing, the pink robe and the dual sets of gloves, over her own body to ensure no biological material would trace back to her skin or regular garments. She executed the primary target while the victim slept, then immediately neutralized the secondary target upon his arrival in the hallway. Following the violence, she maintained enough adrenaline control to strip off the contaminated gear, hide it in the exterior trash bin, return the heavy rifle to the adjacent structure, and then systematically activate a hysterical persona for the neighbors. The mental compartmentalization required to transition from a calculated executioner to a weeping, orphaned daughter within a 10-minute window demonstrated a profound lack of empathy. The teenager viewed the victims not as family members, but purely as logistical obstacles blocking her access to an adult relationship. When the ultimatum was delivered, threatening the 19-year-old laborer with deportation, the parents unknowingly sealed their own fate. The daughter processed their authority as a threat to her survival and chose absolute elimination as the only viable countermeasure. The facade of the perfect suburban student was completely dismantled by the unyielding reality of the forensic data. The judicial response in Blaine County was swift and absolute. In 2005, the teenager was transferred to an adult court facility to stand trial for 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution did not rely on emotional appeals. They deployed an unyielding sequence of forensic facts. The primary exhibits presented to the jury were the DNA-matched latex glove and the saturated pink bathrobe. The physical data directly connected the defendant to the execution of her parents. The defense counsel attempted to redirect the blame. They suggested an unknown third party orchestrated the massacre and planted the biological evidence to frame the high school student. However, the ballistic trajectories, the chemical residue on the leather gloves, and the strict timeline of the discarded items rendered that theory completely unviable. The trial lasted several weeks, but the jury deliberations were notably brief. The verdict was unanimous. Sarah Marie Johnson was found guilty on all charges. The judge delivered the maximum allowable penalty for a juvenile in the state of Idaho, 2 concurrent life sentences in a state correctional facility, entirely revoking any possibility of parole. The courtroom remained completely silent as the sentence was finalized. The calculated strategy to eliminate her family to secure an adult relationship ended in permanent incarceration. The illusion of suburban safety is a fragile construct. Behind the meticulously manicured lawns of Bellevue, a lethal calculation was incubating. Sarah Marie Johnson did not merely eliminate her parents. She dismantled the entire foundation of her existence for a fleeting obsession. The heavy steel doors of the Idaho State Penitentiary have closed permanently, sealing away the architect of this massacre. There is no parole, there is no escape, just the echoing silence of a fractured family, and the lingering visual of a blood-saturated robe. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.